In the 1990s, Swissair seemed determined to become the dominant force of the European airline market, a company that, through an aggressive expansion campaign, had gone from being a minor player against neighbouring flag carriers such as Lufthansa, Air France and Alitalia, to being one of the most influential firms with a board of strong non-executive directors. Though in the space of only a few years, what seemed to be the crowning success of 1990s commercial aviation collapsed into bankruptcy, the culmination of poor strategic decisions, a failure to properly assess risk, and a dangerous over-reliance on external consultants, illustrating that no brand was invulnerable to potential failure, regardless of its strength or size. Swissair first came into existence in March 1931, following the merger of two regional Swiss airlines, Balair and Ad Astra Aero, eventually being listed on the Zurich Stock Exchange in 1947, and growing significantly throughout the 1950s from its original fleet of 13 airliners and 64 employees. Though with its native Switzerland surrounded on all sides by much larger nations, the Swiss flag carrier, in the wider scheme of European commercial aviation, was often overlooked when compared to more influential firms such as BOAC, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM and Alitalia. Though despite the limitations of a small domestic market, both in terms of population, geographical size, and a comprehensive road and public transport system, Swissair was still able to carve out a niche for itself, capitalizing on the Swiss reputation for precision timing and reliability by providing first-class travel that was second to none against its rivals, winning numerous travel awards in the process. Throughout the mid-20th century, Swissair, like most European flag carriers, was largely state-owned, and thus enjoyed high levels of subsidy and protectionism to prevent what was otherwise a largely loss-making enterprise from fiscal collapse, most national airlines being highly integrated and included a whole range of airline-related activities, but at the same time were strictly unionized and thus open to the possibility of frequent strike action by the workforce, though unlike its contemporaries, Swissair was able to avoid the threat of industrial action and deliver an exceptional degree of service while companies such as British Airways and Air France were mired in legal disputes against the trade unions. Flag carriers of the period generally dominating departure and arrival slots at their designated national hubs and often had a monopoly on services, such as in-flight catering, baggage handling and check-in facilities that were provided to other airlines for a nominal fee, while negotiations between the respective governments allowed for bilateral reciprocal agreements to be reached for airlines to operate out of foreign hubs. In 1987, the strength of the nationalised flag carriers was upturned when the European Commission introduced a three-phase 10-year reform of the industry, ultimately enabling European Union airlines to operate on any route in the EU, including flights wholly within another country, and by January 1993, the international skies across the European Union were effectively open to any EU airline for both long and short-haul flights, with a new breed of carrier rapidly emerging under these liberalised conditions known as the low-cost carrier, with companies such as Ryanair, EasyJet and Virgin Express taking a leaf from the no-frills book of successful low-cost carriers in America, such as Southwest Airlines, and applying it to the European market to undercut the legacy competition. Though despite this, the national flag carriers still dominated the main hubs, and with the allocation of slots now a hotly disputed issue as low-cost carriers attempted to move in, access to airports became more important, meaning Swissair was forced to watch from the sidelines of the EU and continue negotiating bilateral agreements with the individual governments. Amidst the deregulation of the EU airline industry, in 1989 Swissair had joined forces with the US carrier Delta and Singapore Airlines to create the Global Excellence Network, or GEN, one of the first global alliances to be established between major national carriers, and would offer an unparalleled level of service and number of flights. Though in the wake of Switzerland voting not to join the European Union in 1992, the foreign partners quickly began to question Swissair's ability to present a major player on the wider European scene without having easy access to other EU member states, putting severe pressure on the Swiss national airline to expand and break into the European community so as to present a viable partner to Delta and Singapore Airlines, a solution briefly presenting itself in the form of Alcazar, a joint venture concept devised in April 1993 between Scandinavian Airline Systems, or SAS, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, Swissair, and Austrian Airlines to merge their respective operations and enable them to compete with both major European and American carriers on both international and domestic operations. The potential merits of this scheme being enough to give the senior staff at some of Europe's largest and most influential airlines, including Lufthansa, cause for concern as to their future prospects when competing against this new alliance. Unfortunately, negotiations as to how Alcazar would be developed failed to reach a unanimous conclusion, and by the end of 1993, the proposed alliance had been abandoned due to the existing corporate deals being shared between the member airlines and their respective American partners, with KLM and Swissair set to lose the most in the event that they had to give up their US bilateral arrangements, with KLM having brokered a superb deal with Northwest Airlines, while Swissair was not willing to surrender its prospective route to big business through Delta Airlines, compounded further by the threat of layoffs and the loss of Switzerland's flag carrier in the event the project went ahead, the collapse of Alcazar, along with Swissair's exclusion from the EU market, leading them to seek advice from American management consulting firm McKinsey & Company, McKinsey proposing a dual strategy for the airline, which would consist of acquiring minority stakes in foreign airlines so as to strengthen the airline business and build up a critical mass in the EU market, while at the same time implementing horizontal integration into airline-related activities in an attempt to diversify the portfolio. With the Swissair senior staff essentially outsourcing all corporate decision-making to McKinsey, the company became a major account for the American consulting firm, their reports going unchallenged and their word taken for granted, this huge amount of influence over the airline being generally due to the advice of Swissair company board member Lucas Mühlemann, an ex-McKinsey partner who heavily promoted their experience in the field and was well connected to the McKinsey network, the McKinsey strategy taking the form of a three-pronged approach that included revenue enhancement, cost reduction, and reduction of asset intensity, predicting that, by the end of the 1990s, airlines would fall into one of three categories: network managers, capacity providers, and service providers, and that the network managers would rake in the lion's share of the profits, thus acting as the integrator for networks, product design, scheduling, pricing, brand management, and sales. The key success criteria being access to a sufficiently large market to supply the global network, together with strong marketing and cost management competencies within the organization, a role to which Swissair was considered more than suitable to fill. In terms of cost, Swissair was paying a heavy price for its stable industrial relations compared with its European neighbours, with Swissair salaries being one-third higher than those found at British Airways, the disparity of which needed to be addressed, but in so doing would require the development of new, more sophisticated skills to manage employee relations across the entire network, McKinsey advising Swissair to hone its brand management skills to cover not only its own operations, but also those of its future capacity providers, creating a brand concept across the network, but at the same time avoiding dilution of Swissair's prestigious mark, leading, in 1995, to the company being restructured into a holding group called the Swissair Group, which was broken up into four divisions: S-Airlines, S-Air Logistics, S-Air Services, and S-Air Relations, each with operations around the world related to the travel industry. And by 1997, the non-passenger related businesses accounted for over 60% of the group's total turnover of $7.6 billion, as compared to 24% in 1990. By the middle of the decade, as competition in the global airline industry intensified, more and more cross-continental alliances developed, with 1996 seeing British Airways, American Airlines, Cathay Pacific and Qantas announcing the formation of a new global alliance called oneworld, followed in 1997 by SkyTeam, as led by Air France, and Star Alliance under United Airlines, Lufthansa and SAS, Swissair following suit in early 1998 with the Qualifier Group, initially consisting of itself and 5 other member airlines: Sabena, Austrian Airlines, TAP of Portugal, Turkish Airlines, and AOM of France, while at the same time, in an attempt to gain control over capacity providers, Swissair had started to buy equity stakes in regional European airlines, buying, in May 1995, a 49.5% minority stake in the Belgian national airline Sabena, which, while illustrating routes to the former African colonies of Belgium, together with North America and the Far East, saw 80% of its traffic generated from internal European operations, the carrier also being in a very poor corporate shape, with it having only ever shown profit once in its existence, while the remainder of its tenure was mired in disastrous worker relations and rampant strike action, the Belgian government, having carried Sabena's ever-increasing losses for so long, seeking a suitable form of relief through a corporate partner, at which point Swissair, under the advice of McKinsey, stepped in to make an offer. Despite Credit Suisse valuing Sabena at zero, and with Swissair's accountants being skeptical of taking on such a loser, there were many distinct advantages as to acquiring a minority share in the Belgian flag carrier, chief among which was the airline's recently refurbished hub at Brussels, which was well established, modern, and in the heart of Europe, while also not being constrained by overnight noise abatement restrictions, with Sabena itself still carrying 4 million passengers per annum that served many areas of Europe that Swissair could not. The Swiss national airline, despite valuing the company at zero, purchasing its share in Sabena for 240 million Swiss francs in cash, plus a further 20 million Swiss francs in participating certificates. while the Belgian state received 159 million Swiss francs of 6.5% interest-bearing loan warrants to pay off Sabena's previous partner Air France, Swissair subsequently being granted the option to take on a majority shareholding of 62% and later 85%, one of the implicit assumptions in the financial benefits of the deal for Swissair being the realization of substantial synergies on integrating the two airlines. However, amidst the Sabena purchase, financial performance for the Swissair group had been deteriorating, with blame being primarily placed on company CEO Otto Lopfer, thus seeing his role be gradually transferred from September 1995 to the leadership of Philippe Brugisier, a long-time airline industry executive and officer at Swissair, who turned round the associated companies in a very aggressive manner, particularly the catering arm, his rise to the position of president and CEO of Swissair Group in 1996 coming alongside the appointment of Paul Reutlinger as Executive Vice President of Marketing and Ground Services, while Jeffrey Katz of American Airlines was brought in as CEO of the airline division. Though despite this rapid change in management, the acquisition of a minority share in Sabena did not produce the synergies hoped for by the Swissair senior staff, and the inability for the two firms to integrate properly, together with a war of personalities between the Swiss management and Belgian trade unions, meant further development of the company and the confidence of its customers was starting to become jeopardized, leading the Swissair board to place Reutlinger in charge of Sabena. At this point, any intention to integrate Sabena and Swissair were abandoned, while of the 12 synergy initiatives initially identified by McKinsey, only 3 remained, Sabena's losses in 1996 amounting to 220 million Belgian francs, and the passenger load factor for the carrier had decreased to an average of 59%, making it the lowest in Europe for any national airline. Brugisier, in November 1996, announcing that the investment in Sabena would be written off in Swissair's books, and the Swiss carrier's share price plummeted, thus seeing the airline struggle over the next 12 months to achieve the promised synergies, this being followed in November 1997 by the Sabena board placing an order for 34 new aircraft, including Airbus A320s, A330s and A340s, to replace its aging fleet of Boeing 747-300s and Douglas DC-10s. The $1 billion cost of this purchase deal being 5 times the company's entire capital, while the transition of Sabena's fleet from a largely Boeing-based range to an Airbus one meant 650 Sabena pilots had to be retrained at a cost of 17 million Belgian francs. The actual financing for this investment never being publicly disclosed in detail, though despite this huge financial commitment, Sabena, for the 1998 fiscal year, announced a profit for only the second time in its 75-year history, though it transpired the following year that this was in fact an accounting error, and that this profit was only generated through the widespread sale of Sabena's Boeing fleet to other carriers. By 1999, the flight activity made an operational loss of 39.6 million Belgian francs, and the cash position had shrunk from 223 million Belgian francs in 1998 to 124 million in 1999. While making matters worse were delays in the delivery of Sabena's new Airbus A340 quad-jet airliners that were expected to enter service in either 2001 or 2002, creating a funding requirement of 513.5 million Belgian francs. The Belgian government, still in possession of the majority stake, becoming increasingly worried as Sabena's debt climbed to 2.3 billion Belgian francs, and thus they attempted to persuade Swissair to take up the option of an 85% majority share in the ailing flag carrier, while in their quest to seek other potential airline partners, should Swissair not acquire the majority share, no other carrier was willing to take a gamble on Sabena due to its ruinous financial situation, only offering minority shares and nothing more. McKinsey, in late 1997, providing Swissair with a new multi-partner strategy, known as the Hunter strategy, that, through the creation of cross-equity shareholdings with European national airlines, would allow Swissair to bypass the need to negotiate bilateral traffic rights with the individual EU markets, the focus being on markets with growth potential such as Belgium, Austria, Finland, Hungary, Portugal and Ireland, rather than more mature European markets such as France, Germany and the UK, with regional carriers landing at the now massively expanded Zurich hub being intended for use as feeders to Swissair's extensive intercontinental network. Through the Hunter strategy, McKinsey predicted an increase in capacity and passenger frequency that would make Swissair an attractive partner for a large American airline, and thereby create the 4th most influential airline in Europe behind Lufthansa, Air France and KLM. Brugisier, though having doubts as to the boldness of the scheme, following McKinsey's advice and beginning investment in its new qualifier partners, purchasing a 10% stake in Austrian Airlines and a 5% stake in Delta alongside its existing Sabena shareholding, followed in 1999 by the acquisition of shares in 3 French airlines, AOM, Air Liberté and Air Littoral, and members of the Volair Group, LOT Polish Airlines, and South African Airways, making for a total investment of 4.1 billion Swiss francs, all acquisitions being approved by the company board based on McKinsey's advice, despite the fact that, with the exception of LOT, all of these firms were in a poor financial state and teetering on bankruptcy, Grüezi's angle being that Swissair would build a portfolio of airlines that, once cross-country mergers were allowed within the European Union, would provide easy consolidation of Swissair's stakes in minority holdings. Come the end of 1999, Swissair, having invested in 49% of Sabena, as well as minority stakes in various other loss-making carriers, and through its expansion into airline catering, airline maintenance, cargo and ground services, should have been, in theory, closer to realizing its objective. But with an oil price spike at the beginning of 2000, the airline industry, including ancillary services, began to suffer. This factor, together with the poor performance of Swissair's investments, leading the board to question the company's ability to finance the underlying strategy, the holding structure of Swissair Group being highly complex, with the net result that it was virtually impossible for the board to get a clear view of the group's overall financial position at any moment in time, while the number of board members between 1995 and 1999 had shrunk from a very top-heavy 20 to a much more manageable 9, though none of the 9 board members had a background in the airline industry. Direct remuneration of board members being almost negligible, with fees of 800 Swiss francs per meeting and the equivalent of approximately 15,000 Swiss francs in shares, while family members of the board were allowed seats in first class on unlimited Swissair flights around the world, and board meetings themselves were reputedly preceded by large food and drink extravaganzas. In September 1998, Philippe Grüezi purchased a 49.9% stake in the German tour operator and charter airline LTU for 894 million Swiss francs. But by 2000, the German airline was showing a loss of 390 million euros, while during the same year, clashes of opinion developed between Katz, CEO of the airline business, and other senior management over both Katz's personal ambitions and the strategic direction of the airline division, leading the American to eventually resign from the role, where he was replaced by Grüezi, who himself was already inundated with his existing responsibilities. A lack of confidence between the senior staff as to their abilities, resulting in a breakdown of communication between the CEO and the management team, so much so that, when Grüezi proposed a merger with Italian flag carrier Alitalia, he relied on an external consultant to undertake due diligence work, the board fully endorsing his pursuit of Alitalia, despite it being yet another financial basket case, and one of the worst performers in Europe, second only to Sabena. To meet EU requirements about ownership of airlines, acquisitions of minority interests under the Hunter strategy were invariably accounted for in complex financial structures to ensure they remained only as minority shareholding in the consolidated financial statements, this being despite Swissair, in some cases, maintaining effective operational control over the entities, a situation which would normally require the group to fully consolidate the interests as subsidiaries, the additional financial commitments required for these putting increasing pressure on the company, with McKinsey performing a review of the financing requirements in August 2000 that resulted in estimates of between 3.25 and 4.45 billion Swiss francs. The Swissair board, with no slack in the balance, being forced to abandon the Hunter strategy, while Grüezi's 22-year career at Swissair was terminated in January 2001, followed 2 months later by 9 of the company's 10 directors announcing their resignation to take effect over the next 13 months. Mario Corti, by then chairman of Swissair, being appointed Group CEO in March 2001, and announced 1 month later at a press conference that, for the 2000 fiscal year, Swissair had sustained its biggest ever loss of 2.9 billion Swiss francs, despite a 24.8% increase in turnover. The situation by mid-2001 being that the group's balance sheet was only 5% equity and 95% debt, which had escalated to 17 billion Swiss francs, despite the fact that only 6 months earlier, the chief financial officer had forecast a profit of 200 million Swiss francs. Following a change in external auditors from PricewaterhouseCoopers to KPMG International, the Swissair Group restated its balance sheet from December 31, 2000, cutting its equity from 1.2 billion to 716 million Swiss francs, the full cost of Swissair's expansion strategy being revealed when, against an operational profit fall of only 11% to 603 million Swiss francs in 2000, the exceptional costs and losses from investments totaled 3.2 billion Swiss francs, with the equity value on most of Swissair's airline investments, including Sabena, LTU, AOM, Air Littoral, Volair, LOT, and South African Airways, being written off entirely. Provisions also being made for Swissair's share of the losses on investments in the same airlines, with 72% of the company's shareholder equity being wiped out, the disposal plan being increased so as to counter the steadily growing debt, although many transactions required further cash outlays in order to stem the losses, Swissair being forced to renege on its agreement to increase its stake in Sabena to 85% and inject more funds, leading to the Belgian government taking the Swiss flag carrier to court over the matter, ultimately coming to a settlement in August 2001, with Swissair Group and the Belgian government providing Sabena with cash funds of 258 million and 172 million Belgian francs respectively, Swissair being allowed to walk away without taking up the further stake in Sabena, the carrier, in the meantime, also being able to rid itself of its French airline interests, with a total of 200 million francs being contributed to the relaunch of AOM Air Liberté by a former Air France pilot, while 200 million Swiss francs was committed to a restructuring plan for Air Littoral, which was taken over by the airline's former CEO. However, before any further shedding of Swissair's investments could be made, a terrorist attack on September 11, 2001, against the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., had a disastrous and immediate effect on the entire airline industry as passengers refused to fly, and with no more income to help keep the ailing carrier afloat, Swissair was grounded on October 2, 2001, followed shortly thereafter by the firm entering receivership, the collapse of the Swissair Group having net liabilities of 1 billion Swiss francs, though of its 7.8 billion Swiss francs of assets, 7.3 billion of these were either loans to group companies or equity investments in subsidiaries, the final cost to the banks and bondholders topping at 6 billion Swiss francs, the economic and political class of Switzerland scrambling to try and save not only just the national carrier, but also the image of the country on the world stage, giving rise to Project Phoenix as a new flag airline that would emerge from the ashes of Swissair, a total of 2.7 billion Swiss francs being pledged from both governments and corporate sources, among them cantonal authorities in Zurich and the Swiss banks UBS and Credit Suisse, while other corporate investors included Novartis, Roche, Swissair Re, and Nestlé, which poured millions into the project. Under Phoenix, the regional carrier, Crossair, obtained leases on planes from Swissair's fleet and took over the slots for the majority of Swissair's domestic destinations, although transfer of the international slots could not be registered before March 2002, thus meaning a further 1.5 billion Swiss francs were sunk into Swissair to keep it aloft until the eventual launch of Swiss International Airlines, which got off to an uneven start due to various corporate restructuring programs that involved widespread redundancies and aircraft disposals. Swiss International posting a loss of nearly 1 billion Swiss francs during its first year of operations, which gradually narrowed to 687 million Swiss francs for the 2003 fiscal year. Though despite this narrowing of its loss margin, Swiss would continue to suffer from a high cost base with soaring fuel costs, an extremely tight market in the wake of both the war in Iraq and the SARS virus, and voracious competition from low-cost carriers, while the airline alliances of Oneworld and Star Alliance refused to allow Swiss entry into their executive groups, Swiss International eventually being sold at a cost of €310 million to Lufthansa in April 2004, with the German flag carrier gaining access to the Zurich hub and a highly sought-after business class and first-class travel customer base, while Swiss, for its part, was assured of its precious independence and continued operation of Zurich Airport as an intercontinental hub, thereby guaranteeing jobs as well as sustaining the tourism industry and business sector. Ultimately, the collapse of Swissair demonstrated the very definition of corporate hubris, while at the same time relying too heavily on the strategies of external consultants rather than one's own intuition and instinct when it came to feeling the pulse of the airline market, leading to a series of aggressive expansion efforts and investments in firms that were abject losers financially and rife with corporate inefficiencies that meant there was little to no chance of them being turned into profit makers. Swissair, by the time of the September 11th attacks, already being essentially in its death throes, with a major event in the aviation industry, as elicited by the terrorist acts, only serving to separate those carriers strong enough to survive the downturn through sensible decision-making, and those that had acted brashly and created a portfolio of failures that only served to drag them down in the end, a situation to which Swissair fell firmly into the latter.